Good morning. I'm Dusky Terry, President of ITC Midwest. For the third straight year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and extraordinarily proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As an electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is invested in and has a very real stake in the future of Iowa. We've supported this conference since its inception because we embrace its mission of gathering hundreds of Iowans together to explore the key questions and the big ideas that will shape the future of our state. ITC Midwest was formed in 2007 to improve electric transmission reliability and increase transmission system capacity in Iowa. And we followed through on that commitment with more than $4.1 billion in capital investments to date. Our investments in the system not only serve the changing needs of customers, they also provide additional capacities to support economic growth and development of low-cost renewable energy resources. Our investments have resulted in a 62% drop in transmission-related outages since ITC acquired the system and began operating it. From extreme weather events such as last year's derecho to the unprecedented transition to renewable energy, from the rapid adoption of electric vehicles to the increasing focus on energy system resilience, the electric utility industry is suddenly in the national spotlight. All of these forces reinforce the critical role of the transmission grid to support the changing landscape and ensure consumers have access to low-cost, clean, and reliable electricity. You know, we often talk about here at ITC about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There's also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your mind to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place now and in the future. I want to thank you for your participation to help shape the future and wish you a great conference.
Welcome everybody to this session of Iowa Ideas. Hopefully you guys enjoyed your first sessions this morning. This one's called A Fresh Look at Community. For those of you that may not know, the description here is back to normal. It's simply not in the cards when it comes to the elements of the community. How should we redefine a successful community? So we'll discuss different assets there. I'm joined by three of our panelists, three great panelists. We have Sarah Grunewaldt, Jason Neises, and Jeff Speck. We'll go around the rotation and they'll briefly introduce themselves, what their roles are, projects, initiatives that they're working on, anything they'd like to share very briefly. Sarah, you're first on my screen. Do you want to go first? And then we'll go Jason and then Jeff.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Grunewaldt. I am the Executive Director of Main Street Washington here in Washington, Iowa. My current role is to keep the wheels on. Basically, Main Street is a 4-point program that focuses on historic preservation as an economic development tool. So we do grant programs, community events, we do business recruitment and retention training, and then we work with volunteers. So I kind of have a holistic look of how to restore our community. And we've been at it since 2008. And this year and last year, we've really gotten our feet underneath us and we're really starting to roll. So that's pretty exciting. We have had 18 new businesses open in the last 2 years. So
Jason, Jason, before you go, I want to remind everyone watching, one, please mute your mics if you can. And two, if you have any questions during the panel, go ahead and submit in the Q&A and we can answer those and ask those. So yeah, again, please mute your mics. Jason, you're good to go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Neises. I'm the Community Development Coordinator for the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque. We work in a 7-county region in eastern Iowa, right along the Mississippi River. And our foundation, our mission is to strengthen community and inspire giving. And we do that by helping communities really understand their needs and do very broad-based grassroots community engagement work that helps get missing voices at the table, let people tell their stories about why they love their rural communities and create a positive narrative that inspires people to get involved, not just as in philanthropy, but also as local leaders and people who are stewards of the good things that exist in so many of our small towns. So.
Oh, Jeff, you're muted there. Bob might have to unmute you. Give it a second. Yeah, when I meant muted, panelists, don't mute yourselves at any point during this.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
Yeah, there you go.
I did not mute myself. Somehow I became muted.
Oh.
And thank you for unmuting me. I'm Jeff Speck. I'm a city planner. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. I focus in my work on making cities more walkable. I wrote a book called Walkable City that talks about the work that I've done in a lot of places, including in Iowa. I guess it's not a coincidence. My wife being from the Quad Cities led me to do a lot of work in Iowa over the years. So I've actually worked on different plans in Des Moines, in Davenport, in Cedar Rapids. And most of the work I do has to do with the redesign of city streets in order to bring downtowns back to life. Although I happen to be working right now in Cedar Rapids on a big plan called Relief Cedar Rapids, where we're responding to the fact that the city lost about 2/3 of its canopy, about 670,000 trees in the derecho of August of last year. So I'm back at work in Iowa and happy to be helping out.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you three here. First, I want to start just on a big picture level. A lot of communities across the state and across the country have experienced different hardships over the last 18 months now plus. Of course, we've had the pandemic. We've here in Iowa, in multiple communities across the state, experienced a derecho and different effects from that. How do you foresee communities changing after? I don't want to be the person to be like after 2020, but how do you foresee communities changing after 2020? How are you already seeing them changing? What are some of these biggest changes and things that we may be leaving behind with 2020 when it comes to communities and how we build those relationships locally and regionally? And anyone feel free to hop in first.
I'll take a crack at it. One of the things that I think as we start to see shifts in workforce, and I think we're starting to see some real data now about people working from home or people who are seeking to move out of rural or out of urban areas into more rural spaces. I think we don't really know for sure what the long-term impact that's going to be, but that's kind of the current research shows those things. I think communities, small towns in particular, need to be ready and sell themselves as good places for people to live, but that takes a lot of work at the community level so that you can identify your assets. Like, what about your town is special? Like, do you have high-speed internet? Do you have good schools? Do you have affordable housing? Like all these things that we think people are going to be looking for as they are more mobile with mobile workforce. How do you tell your story? And I think that takes a lot of work at the local level, so you're not just all over the place. So there needs to be some good coordinated leadership. And usually that leadership comes from, I would say, emerging or unexpected places. Like, it's probably not the guy who's been on the board of supervisors for 35 years who's telling that story effectively. I mean, not that that person should be excluded, but there's a lot going on in the community that it's likely that person may not be as in tune with. So you need a diverse group of leaders from all walks of life who are helping you tell your story. I'm not even so that you can compete for people who are moving. Like that's tough. Like every little small town is competing for the same people, but are you competing for the right people and telling the right story? Like people who used to live in your community, people who grew up there and moved away. Like, how are you talking to those folks about who you are and what you have from a community, from a quality of life standpoint that might be attracted to those folks? I think that's the sweet spot that a lot of small towns should zero in on post-pandemic.
I think from my side of things, I work with a lot of retail and small business, and what the pandemic forced them to do was to get creative and to come into the 21st century. You know, they cannot, no small business is ever going to compete with the Amazons of the world. Let's be honest. But what they were able to do in response to keeping their, you know, not being able to keep their doors open was to offer the curbside service or online shopping. Or we had businesses who did Zooms where they walked through the store with a person on the phone and like personal shopped for them. They offered services they don't normally do. Facebook Live became huge for a lot of my clothing retailers. And it kept their doors open. A lot of them had to launch websites. That Shop Iowa that IEDA put out there was really helpful for a lot of small towns across Iowa. My people had already done their websites by the time that Shop Iowa came around. So I have maybe a handful of businesses on there, but a lot of them were like, I can't have my doors open. I might as well do something about it so that I continue to keep the doors open when this all ends. And so I think across the state, you know, with my other Main Street communities, that's what we saw is a lot of businesses just got really creative. And honestly, their best friend became their phone or their computer.
Sure.
And I guess I would say, you know, the fundamental drivers that were driving people both to urban centers before the pandemic and also to small town centers and big town and small city centers, those haven't changed. So yes, there's been some outmigration from bigger cities due to actually misplaced fears about density, population density correlating with COVID spread. In fact, it's some of the densest cities in the world that had the least spread of COVID. And of course, some of the least dense places in America that have suffered the most from COVID. But whatever the reality, the perception has caused people to leave big cities to a certain degree, many of whom I think find very attractive the quality of life that you can find in many of your smaller cities and town centers. But the fundamental driver that quality of life has to do with coming together with other people hasn't changed. I think we've all experienced in the pandemic and convening over Zoom that it's not the same. Right. And that we really are desperate for one-on-one interaction or one-on-many interaction with other people in physical space. And suburbia, you know, our auto-based lifestyle doesn't provide for that. And it is our community centers, our downtowns, our main streets that provide the opportunity for us to be together. I read an interesting article a while back, and it get a little bit physical here. It described these scientists did some studies of human behavior and found that the first thing that people do after they shake someone else's hand is to find a way to smell their own hands. And, you know, they might wipe their nose or, now it's a little scary when in the framework of a pandemic, but the point is there's a hell of a lot about human interaction that doesn't happen on Zoom, that happens when we're together with each other in the same place. That hasn't changed. The other thing that hasn't changed is the fact that our climate is changing, and that I think many of us are drawn to living more sustainable lifestyles, which is also what happens when you move to a place where you can drive less. The derecho was a climate event. It was a climate event that was no doubt influenced by climate change and global heating. You know, we're in for more of that sort of experience in the future. The best thing we can do to limit that is to live in places where we're less dependent on the automobile.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for those answers. And moving into connectivity and interaction in communities, I'm wondering your guys' take on this. How has your overall outlook on what community can be? How has that changed? Like today, what is community to you? Like communities probably used to be seen as a place to work and live on the surface level. That's still true. But what should a local community look like? And how do you build local community and make people feel involved and connected when anyone can now connect with broader communities anywhere through, you know, we're talking about phones, we're talking about technology, we're talking about social media. How do you keep people's attention, and whether or not you're competing against these other ways of establishing community or using technology to your own advantage to still build a stronger local community. Yeah, I was wondering what you guys think kind of about that.
Well, I think we talked about when we met previously about the Knight Foundation and their soul of the community. And, the top 3 factors that make people love where they live and make people associate with a community and invest in their community is social connectedness. So being able to have opportunities to socialize with other people, that welcoming, open feeling, like if you walk down the street and say hi and someone says hi back, or at least waves or smiles at you, that kind of connective feeling. And then aesthetics, does it look good? Does it feel safe? Does it feel clean? Those things haven't changed regardless of technology. And I think it's really, if you look at those towns, you drive through a small town that you can clearly say they rolled up the welcome mat. People don't smile. They look at you like, oh, this is a stranger. I'm not so sure about this person. And then you can tell that their buildings are starting to show their wear. They're not being maintained. And there's a different feeling when you go into a town who clearly cares about their people, who clearly cares about their built environment, and who clearly cares about the social aspect of a community. And, we have farmers market tonight. It's our last one of the season. It's going to be small, but there's going to be 200 people at 5 o'clock when that bell rings, waiting to buy their pastries from Golden Delight because they like the little Amish ladies and they know that they're going to get a good pie and they're going to see their friends. It's going to happen.
Sure.
I'll jump in. So go ahead.
Go
Dave.
ahead, Jeff.
Okay. We'll reverse the order. So, as a designer, I'm a city planner who does a lot of urban design. For me, community means a lot of things, but I'm most interested in it, what it means from a physical perspective. So what's the physical framework that you can create that will itself create community or allow communities to grow? My experience has been, and I think a lot of people's experience has been over the last decades, that community happens where walking happens. Now, community also happens where biking happens, I guess you could say. When you're moving around on a bike, it's also a pretty social experience. But I think most of us picture what community means in our communities and how we achieve it and how we have those chance encounters with strangers that allow us to maybe hear ideas that aren't our own, aren't our children's or our parents', and kind of evolve the discussion in a way that might, allow democracy to evolve. It's bumping into people on the street. And of course, bumping into someone while you're walking is quite different from bumping into them when you're driving. Mm-hmm. So I work very hard in my career to create spaces in which people make the choice to walk. And a space that's walkable is a space that generates community. I define that as being a place where walking is useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. And in most of our communities, that's happening principally on our main streets and in our downtowns. So walking serves a purpose. Walking is hopefully not a life-threatening activity in terms of being hit by cars. And then there are buildings and shops and friendly faces of things that line the street that cause you to be comfortable there physically and to want to and to be interested when you move around. So that's how I would define community from a physical perspective.
Yeah, to build upon what Jeff and Sarah are saying, when I work with a process called Community Heart and Soul to help communities find their story and what matters to them and build the future of their town around those deeply held ideas about what they care about. And one of the first things that they always talk about, every town, I mean, this is pretty universal. What do you love about this town? The people. Like, it's the first thing they say. And we always dig a little deeper, like, tell me more about that. And why is that? And I think like what Jeff is talking about, like there is this desire to see people, like they do want to interact with them. And I think especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic, like this idea that we are trying to now rebuild our muscle memory a little bit on how we do this and how we do it safely, and help recreate narratives for people around those things that they care about. Like if you really care about people, it's interesting you have to be intentional about creating ways for them to see each other. So I think a lot of the community engagement work that we do, we try to create spaces where they can meet new people, they can get out of their bubble, that it's not going to be a typical kind of like community meeting or fact-finding thing where they're like standing at a podium talking to city council. Like that stuff just doesn't work anymore as community engagement to get all the voices around the table. And just help them think differently about their town. Like Jeff, when you were talking about walkability, I couldn't help but think about this meeting I had with a small group of very concerned citizens in a quite small town, where they used to have a couple taverns and things like that. But the main thing that they had in their town that they love was their school. Like they have an elementary school there, and it's really a big draw. But they're concerned because the town is, of course, surrounded by farmland, and we don't have any place to grow, was their story. But sitting in this meeting space, I looked across the street. There were probably 5 empty lots where they used to have old homes or old stores or old feed stores or whatever that had been torn down. But to them, like development for them was housing developments out on the outskirts of town and things. And I'm thinking, there are 5 lots there that are in walking distance to the school that you said you love. And there's about 4 or 5 empty storefronts within like 2 blocks from these empty spots. Like imagine if there was a coffee shop or a little retail shop or something in one of those spaces, and you had some lovely townhomes or nice homes that are fairly dense, but where a small family just starting off could be finding an affordable home. That would be gold in this town. And to be walkable, it would have that sense of community, all those things. But their narrative, their mindset was, oh, we can't grow because we don't have big 2-acre lots on the outskirts of town anymore.
Yeah, and Jason, when I hear you say, wouldn't it be great to have a coffee shop? The first thing that strikes me is, okay, well, that coffee shop has to survive. Yep. And the number one thing that we look at when trying to improve downtown centers is the number of people that live within a 5 or 10 minute walk of that center. Yep. And the amenities that a lot of people want and feel they lack in these smaller communities are often lacking directly because there isn't enough housing within close proximity to that downtown. And that often is an outgrowth of single family zoning and other factors that limit the density. There's this great fear of anything other than a single family house, when of course the most lovely, the places that we get on planes to visit when we're tourists, like a Charleston or a Savannah, or a Carmel by the Sea, are all replete with these, what we call missing middle types of housing. Yep. These row houses, these mansion apartments that look like a mansion, but they're 4 units. These kind of delicate insertions of somewhat higher density that get enough bodies in close proximity to the main street, so the main street actually can survive. And of course, we do have a housing crisis in this country, at least in some parts of it. Perhaps the surprising thing is that if you create, this gentle version of missing middle housing in your downtown, it will become the more attractive place that more people want to be.
It's always one of those, the challenge always is like, how do these things kind of grow side by side with each other? Because it's hard, because I think it's one of those chicken or the egg kind of things too, sometimes in small towns. To get that critical mass of people to support the coffee house, you need houses. To have the houses, people want to live in a place where they can do things. It's always kind of a little back and forth, but it's a worthy goal. It takes a lot of coordination. And I think if your town has a vision for these things, and if people are talking to each other and they're coordinated in doing some of the stuff that Sarah is talking about, like to really have people who are on the same page and have a common vision, those things can kind of happen concurrently in a way that the community really benefits from.
Well, one of the things kind of going, sorry, Jeff, the one thing we're doing, and it has to do with housing specifically, is our county economic development group has gathered realtors, builders, bankers, social workers, daycare providers, community social groups like Main Streets and Chambers, and also just random business people who want to see the community grow, and put them in a room together and said, we need housing. How can we get things done? We got townhomes out of it. We've gotten new apartments out of it. We're getting some duplexes out of it. We're getting some single family homes out of it. It's spurred, and this has been going on for about 3-4 years now, but it's spurring conversation with interested parties like that coffee shop owner who has a vision for a community and wants to see their business go, but doesn't maybe have the backing to build a new house that they could spec. But here's all these other people who do know the business and can actually do it. And so getting those people in the room together, and even the ones you don't think should be there, like the school district, the hospital, your manufacturers, all of those people are important because they all either need workers or they have students they need to house and educate. They have patients. It's getting those people in the room. They may not be contributing financially to the problem, but they certainly have an impact on the conversation.
And schools are often the places where community gathers and is formed. And of course, school buildings, if your school district is doing their job well, school buildings are not just for the school. They're community centers that are being used for all sorts of other events too. Jason, I wanted to pick up on your chicken and egg conversation. In some ways it's chicken and egg, in some ways it isn't. I mean, residents, the businesses won't thrive unless there are enough residents there. Residents won't come perhaps unless there's cool businesses and other things happening on the main street, which leads me to think about a couple things. I talked about single family zoning and code impediments, perhaps that are limiting the amount of people in your city. Are there other code impediments? For example, rules against push carts, rules against food trucks, other things limiting business opportunities, because you really need to incubate the smaller businesses, the local businesses first, perhaps in an ad hoc way. And you guys are more experts on this than me, particularly Sarah, to get that stuff started. But also, let's just say you don't have that sort of critical mass where you can have that Main Street feel because there just isn't enough stuff going on. That's where I look to something that we call temporal community, and the idea that, okay, let's make it Thursday night. Like, let's just decide that Thursday night is the night where all the stores are open late, whatever we've got, that the food trucks are from the region are welcome in, and push carts are welcome in. And let's make that the night that our Main Street really sings. And that creates memories for people that causes them to want to be in your community. And that's often how you can get the egg out of the chicken.
Yeah, 100%.
Definitely. Well, we actually have a couple questions from people watching already. Anyone can tackle this first one. Maybe Sarah, maybe you can go first on this one. Someone asked, how can we best showcase our community through social media? Do any of you guys have strategies surrounding that, or things you're working on, Sarah, with Washington?
So our city does not have a Facebook page. They never have, they never will. They do not want one. So one of the things that we've done, we have Main Street, which focuses on downtown. We have a Chamber of Commerce as well. The two of us, plus our economic development in the county level, we work really, really hard to showcase our community. And it's, in the best way possible, sharing good news, sharing pictures. Number one, people like seeing people in pictures. So, and getting good quality photos of your community and activities that are happening. If you're throwing a parade to celebrate 4th of July, hire a photographer to take pictures of kids grabbing candy off the sidewalk. Just do it. You will not regret that. And you will not regret the $200 it's going to cost you to do it. 100%. Because people like looking at pictures of people. For example, we have a farmer's market here in Washington. I am kind of partially in charge of it. I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm the boss. Anyways, when we started doing more with social media, the woman who takes the pictures for us is wonderful, but she took pictures of product and we saw very little traction on those product photos. So like 2 weeks later, I'm looking at the numbers and I looked at her and I said, Dina, I need you to take pictures of people picking out tomatoes or picking out their bread. And I want you to get them smiling. And I don't care if they're looking at you or they're looking at the vendor. I want you to get a picture of a person. our numbers skyrocket. We get 3,000 to 5,000 impressions on those photos every week for 22 weeks straight. And that's just farmers market. So people pictures are important. Good captions are important. Also, if you have businesses that are involved, tag your businesses and then have them take your photo and make their own post on their page and tag you. Facebook rewards native content. It does not, it doesn't like shares. You know, shares are great, but you will get much more bang for your buck if your women's clothing boutique and your chamber, your Main Street, your community organization, or your city both post the same content independently of each other and tag each other back and forth. That's my best advice.
I would also build upon that by saying, be really intentional about it. I think have a plan, even if it's something very basic, like the number of posts you want to do, or looking ahead to different events or different things happening in the community, and being intentional about what you're going to say, what you want to do. Like Sarah said, the kinds of photos you want to take. It's super important. And just this whole idea that you have to do it. You don't want to overdo it. I think there's a weird balance in how many posts you do and how few you do and things, but I think you also want to be sure it is important to tag other businesses and things. I think it's also important to understand what social media works in your town. I've seen communities go all in on Twitter or whatever. It's like, who in your community uses Twitter? Like, no kidding. You know, it's just not a thing in a lot of towns, but Facebook often is. Instagram and even like Snapchat and some of those things for certain audiences, like know your audience. How do you connect with those folks and use those effectively? But you don't have to do everything. You don't have to do every social media whoop-de-doo that's out there. Know your audience, focus in on that, and you'll see some pretty immediate things. Facebook Live, I think too, like Sarah said, has been a massive thing for a lot of people. A lot of organizations have used that pretty effectively, because Facebook does kind of boost those live feeds and people see it even if they're not looking for you.
Yeah, and to piggyback that one, Facebook will boost any post that you post after you're live. So if you use their scheduling feature, so if you do a live about your community municipal band or concert or something, and then the next week you make 2 or 3 other posts that are about your upcoming farmers market and your this great new coffee shop that's opening, those posts will get more views because you did live. So there's all these little tricks, and it's always changing. But we did a survey of our community to see how people were finding out about things. Facebook was number 1, followed by Instagram, and then followed by our newspaper and our radio station, and then our website.
We've even found Facebook to be a good way to reach folks who might be kind of on the margins, people who may not, they don't, especially like low income audiences and things. A lot of times they are on Facebook, like they're on social media, they're on their phone. They might not have a laptop, they might not have a computer or whatever, but they're on their phones. And especially the social aspect of Facebook and other social media, people who are struggling or in need are looking for support. So they're trying to connect, make these networks for each other. So especially if you have a food pantry or something like that in your community, be sure you're using Facebook to let folks know what's going on, because it's a very common place for people in need to seek help.
Definitely. Jeff, do you have a take on this? Otherwise, the next audience question is directly for you, and I can read that one.
I have very little social expertise on social media expertise, or social expertise for that matter.
So this next question is, like I said, Jeff, for you. It's actually from Cedar Rapids City Council member Ashley Van Orney. She said, Jeff, you are currently engaged in Cedar Rapids, but how can we best help to share this investment in our community with those outside the Cedar Rapids city limits to successfully build a better intentional Iowa?
So there's a couple things. One thing is that I'm doing, the super deep dive with my partners at Confluence Landscape, working with Trees Forever, which is an organization that most of you probably know because they're active throughout the region and throughout Iowa, but they're focused in Cedar Rapids and in Des Moines and kind of in that corridor there. we're creating a post-derecho relief plan that I really hope and I believe will become the new standard, or should, if I could say without humility, should become the new standard for reforestation plans or just city forestry plans in their communities. You can bet that through Trees Forever and Cedar Rapids, we will be doing everything possible to share that plan throughout Iowa and also throughout the Midwest and the US. But one thing I've learned in working on this plan is that most cities' best practices in urban forestry are well out of date. And there's a lot that cities can be doing to grow their canopies, either in response to the derecho or some other storm event, or just to become more resilient. There's a lot that cities can be doing to grow their canopies, and particularly using native plants, native trees that aren't being done. So I'm issuing a big kind of watch this space announcement for that relief plan that we're super excited about, and we think is going to be something that comes out of Iowa that is a national benchmark. Secondarily, and not to take too much time, the work that I did in Cedar Rapids years ago that's just about finished now, which is the kind of work I do all over the US, with more success in some places than others, is to make downtown streets safer. And what Cedar Rapidians know is that they had a downtown core that was half one-way streets, half 4-lane streets going in one direction. And slowly over the past really 7 years, we've transformed that street network into a 2-way, mostly 2-lane downtown, because that was the number of lanes that the downtown traffic needed and nothing more. And it wasn't a comfortable place to be physically, just because every street felt like a highway. You know, I look, Sarah, I look at downtown Washington. It's no accident, that's the right term, actually. It's no accident that your downtown square is so popular and successful, because those wide streets are all full of angle parking that slows traffic down, right? Meanwhile, Davenport has a number, like at least still 3 to 4 lane one-way streets, highways barreling through its downtown. And sorry, my wife's from there, but that city hasn't taken my advice for a decade or more. And to think that there's like the kind of overwhelming traffic in Davenport that requires those streets to be designed like highways is just insane. So the main way that the good news in Cedar Rapids could be, you know, copied elsewhere is to do what a lot of communities are doing, which is to learn to right size their streets, to narrow their wide lanes, to make one-way streets that used to be two-way again, to bring in more parking, believe it or not, because that makes the streets slower, and more bike lanes, as we also did in Cedar Rapids.
Thanks for that, Jeff. This question is for all of you guys. In your roles, you know, in your own communities or interacting with other communities, conversations you've been having, what have you seen successful communities doing and embracing to move forward or progress? You guys have touched upon this a little bit in all your other answers, but you know, what makes certain communities thrive more than others? Are there certain themes you're seeing in terms of projects or initiatives? What role does diversity, equity, and inclusion play in some of these projects and initiatives? And then on the other end, you know, are there things that stick out in our themes for communities that maybe aren't thriving as much as they could? Yeah. Anyone can take it first.
I think one of the key elements to almost everything you had on your lengthy list there, Gage, is about leadership. Is leadership, and not just who is in charge or who is perceived as being in charge, but how that leadership engages the community and is open to innovation and new ideas. Like even like Jeff was talking about, are you getting out of the way when people have good ideas? Are you really thinking more broadly about all the assets that you have in your community? And when I say assets, it's not just infrastructure, it's people, right? When I see cool things happening in any of my small towns, inevitably it's like one person or a small group of people who had this really cool idea, and they had the passion and the enthusiasm and maybe a little bit of capital to get it going, but it wasn't a committee. It wasn't some planned development process. It was like some cool person who had this cool idea, and they exist in small towns. And they happen in places where people say, that is awesome, I'm going to get out of the way. And they don't say, yeah, we tried that before and it didn't work, or that'll never work. No one here is going to be interested in that. I mean, Sarah's laughing because she hears that probably every time someone has a good idea. The people in the town are like, good luck with that. Stop doing that. Like, because there are cool people in your communities. And if that's your attitude, they're not going to come out with that great idea. So I really think that that's important, that leaders be really open to innovation and help cultivate those emerging leaders. Like, we all say we want it, but how open are you to it? And does the structure of how decisions are made in your community allow people to come forward with their ideas? I think even the structures of, like, when do we have our meetings? What time of day? Where are they located? Like, some of that stuff is a real barrier for people. So I think we just need to take a much higher altitude look in our communities. How do we make decisions? Who's involved? Who's at the table? And be really intentional about making it an open process. Again, it's easier said than done. And I wish I had a magic process for making that happen, but no one does. But being really intentional about it and making that one of your goals, I think, is a huge thing that any town can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to agree with everything you just said. And 100% of the time, if someone says, we've tried that, we can't do it, my response is, just because we tried it before doesn't mean we can't ask and try it again. It doesn't mean that the door is not closed.
Do it, but why can't that guy do it?
Right.
Yeah.
And for us, we have quite a few leaders in our community that are younger. I would say 50 or less. And I fall into that category, but our public health director previously was in that category. Our hospital CEO, our YMCA director, all of these people that are doing things. Our mayor is 37 years old. It was not like that when Main Street started. But sometimes the retirement of the old dogs is good. And sometimes it's knowing when to get out of the way and just letting people run. Like you said, just letting people take their idea and run with it. Because of that, in our community, we now have a group called Latinos for Washington that is really building on the welcome, opening the doors to our community, to people who are here, but have been marginalized. And because of that group, we're seeing people going through the citizenship process. We're seeing more kids getting involved in sports and activities in our community. We're seeing businesses open. We have 3 businesses in the last 3 years that are run by Hispanic families. We have a Honduran grocery store that has a bodega in the back, and it's got the best food on the planet. They would not have existed 10 years ago, but they're here now and they're thriving. I mean, they are so busy. We've got another group that's doing more with social justice that has come out of the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and all of that stuff. Even in small town Iowa, we're talking about it, and they're doing workshops and seminars and diversity training and inclusivity and working with the police department to be more, inclusive. All of those things are, because people are getting out of the way, they're letting people run with stuff. And, sometimes if you don't think it's going to work, don't volunteer to help figure it out, or volunteer to help figure it out. It might open your eyes to some opportunity.
And I don't want to repeat myself. I'll repeat the topic sentences, which are safer streets and more housing. But I did want to point out that Des Moines is actually an example that I showcase nationally for how a city made the decision that having more residents downtown was key to its future, and actively subsidized with 10 years of tax increment financing and 10 more years of tax abatement, actively subsidized the construction of hundreds and hundreds, actually more than 1,000 units of housing in their downtown core. And cities that really want to thrive understand it's in their best interest to find ways to support growth in that way.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
I would also, just one final note of advice is, people in small towns with good ideas, be sure to find your people Like, because you sometimes in small towns, it's easy to feel isolated, but there are people out there who are your people and who can be your allies. To Sarah's point about the diversity and the equity issues in rural towns, we've created a virtual network called the Rural Equity Network, that where these leaders in small towns who feel like maybe they're the only ones that care about this isn't something that slams you in the face every day in most rural towns. Like issues of race and equity just aren't like front of mind for a lot of people, but we know we need to be concerned. So we've created a virtual network where people can find their people. They can find other rural leaders who are interested in these issues and start building their strength and their ideas and and the capacity that they have to lead this work on a local level. So I just find your people. I think it's really important that we all have our networks to support ourselves.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for that. We only have I think a handful of minutes here already. It's flown by, but based off your guys' answers to the last question, I'm curious, for people in leadership or who are involved in their community, and you're in this position, how do you guys have a strategy or idea of when to know when you need to get out of the way? Like, when do you need to have like that self-reflection and be like, oh, maybe I'm the one that needs to get out of the way this time? Do you guys have any advice for people that may not understand what that means?
That's a really hard one to know when to get out of the way. I think for me, I have some really great volunteers that I work with. And when they have an idea and they are super pumped about it and they want to roll and they've got it figured out. Like, we're going to do it on this date and this is how we're going to get it done. And I've already talked to this person and this is what we're rolling with. That's when I'm like, report back to me when you want to schedule something and you need help with the marketing or you need help with the whatever. Let me see if I can go back to my network of people and see if we can't solve this one tiny piece that maybe you're not hitting, but the rest of it, just do. But it is really hard, especially when people are passionate about something. It is so hard to say, I'm going to take a step back and let you roll. It's harder yet when they're floundering really bad and they don't know what to do. And they need to flounder to figure it out. It's really hard to let them fail too, because you learn a lot from failure. Let's be honest. That's a harder one, is to step back when they're going to fail.
Jason, Jeff, anything to add on that?
I say, Jason, as a foundation, people probably want you in the way the whole time with your resources. I'm a traveling consultant, so it's my job to go in and then get out of the way immediately in most places. But I would say, as a city planner, that there's been a lot more reflection, particularly in the context of our discussion about equity. There's been a lot of reflection in recent years about the negativities, or the negatives actually, that can come from planning. And I think many communities, perhaps tuned in today, wish they had more gentrification, right? But for those of you that are improving, you have to be very wary, I would say, not of gentrification, but of displacement. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit of it was a bit of a discovery for me in the work that I do, to realize, the fundamental kind of definition of what we're trying to do in making places better is to make them less affordable. Like, that happens. That's not our goal, but that's the outcome of our success, is places become less affordable and people become displaced. And so as you do this work, and not after, but before and during, as you do work to make your communities better, you have to keep in mind, you have to build that safety net as you go for folks who might find themselves displaced. I've worked on projects where the local community worked really hard to turn renters into owners as the projects were done, and we're very successful in doing that. So people, for the same money they were paying in rent, ended up owning their properties and not being displaced for that reason. Communities that are growing could really make use of affordable housing trust funds, which are more of a nonprofit thing that, Jason, a foundation like yours might support, to ensure that affordable housing stays in the community in perpetuity. And then, of course, tax abatements governments can offer for people who are struggling, whose taxes go up because their property becomes more valuable. And then, of course, jobs programs to make sure that as development happens in a community, that they're sourcing workers locally and building skills, right, and building futures and careers out of the development that's happening there. So as you succeed, just keep in mind that there are potential costs to that, and you need to have the safety net in place before you get there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I would say, as far as getting out of the way, I think you're right, Jeff, that I think most communities, they want the community foundation at the table, but we are our own worst enemies sometimes as far as how we get resources out into the community. You know, how do we remove barriers to access for some of those dollars? Is the grant process unnecessarily onerous? Like, do we ask organizations to submit reports and financials and things that simply aren't necessary for us to really do effective grant making? So I think we've learned a lot about that through this community engagement work that I do, like, to really understand, like, geez, do you need to be a 501c3 to get this money? Or like, how do we figure that out in a way that really gets the dollars where they're needed the most? And maybe it's not dollars that places need. Maybe it's coaching, or maybe it's capacity building work that isn't always dollars. So to me, that's how community foundations can better position their work, but also in many ways not be the barrier, not be the gatekeeper on the money as much, or the resources. But it's hard, because you want to help.
Definitely.
Sometimes you want to be in the way, but we need to do a better job of doing that.
Definitely. Well, I actually just got the 1 minute warning about 45 seconds ago. So if there's no other lasting thoughts from either of you, I want to thank you three panelists for being on here. And I want to thank everybody watching for participating in Iowa Ideas and submitting questions. And I think we have a little break next, if I'm not wrong, in terms of panels, how it goes. But hopefully you guys come back for the afternoon and enjoy some more panels. And keep up with the work these three panelists are doing. They're doing a lot in communities, and something to learn from for sure. But again, thank you everybody, and enjoy the afternoon session.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys.